Hi, this is Peter Carter here. I'm making a video about the difference between the short-term and the long-term carbon cycle, and the way to explain this for people to understand it easier in terms of the formation of fossil fuels. So this is from my climate change knowledge site, the section on the carbon cycle. So I guess when people say to understand climate change you have to understand the carbon cycle, that's a bit of a turn-off. But really all you need to know is how fossil fuels are formed, and then you understand the long-term carbon cycle, what I call the ultra-long-term carbon cycle, and the difference from that to the carbon cycle which we're all familiar with, which is a short to medium-term carbon cycle. So I played around over the years with a number of illustrations to try and explain the carbon cycle differences. Most of the fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, were formed out of the Carboniferous period, aptly named because it produced vast amounts of carbon. And that is about 300 million years ago. It's also called the age of the reptiles. The Earth's surface was very different to what we know now. The Earth was all ocean and swamps. These three images here show the familiar short to medium term carbon cycle, which of course starts with photosynthesis. And this is either photosynthesis of green plants and leaves on land, or green plants on the surface of the ocean, phytoplankton. And it's exactly the same process of photosynthesis. To remind us what happens in photosynthesis is that the green plant takes in carbon dioxide from the air or the atmosphere. It's the same thing. It takes in water, and then under the influence of sunlight, the sun's energy, the chloroplasts in the plant can manufacture energy for the plant's growth and health. Now this is a recycle. There's no way that the short to medium term carbon cycle can remove in any permanent sense carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or carbon from the carbon cycle. Essentially it's just recycling all the time. Here's the tree taking up carbon dioxide with its leaves. The tree grows, then the tree declines, decays, dies, microorganisms act on it, and then it emits carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide that it takes in is emitted after and through its life cycle. Here's just another image showing the same thing. So over the years I've played around with trying to make my own illustrations and adapting other illustrations on the carbon cycle. And this is the latest one I've done, so I'll go over that. There are carbon cycles. The big distinction is the distinction between the short and medium term carbon cycle and the ultra slow or long term carbon cycle. There's also carbon cycle on land and ocean carbon cycle. So this illustration here, this is the ocean, the sea, and present-day land is here. This would be ancient swampy lands going back in time, hundreds of millions of years. This would be the soil going deep down to the rock, down to the bedrock. And here is the ocean floor, the sediment and rocks under the ocean sediment. Now the big point of the illustration is to illustrate, as I say, the ultra-long-term carbon cycle, by which carbon is sunk in a permanent sense by nature, and this is the only way it can be sunk in a permanent sense. There are four fossil carbon products of this natural process, and we're familiar with them all, of course. There's coal, oil, gas, and there's limestone. This is the section where I show the formation of limestone under many millions of years. So at a minimum, it takes millions of years to form what we call fossil fuels, to form all these kinds of fossil carbon. The formation is done by time and by heat and pressure over time. So it's essentially the same process in all of these slightly different forms of fossil carbon. You'll see that there's not much land compared to ocean, and this is to illustrate the fact that the living space on Earth is practically all ocean. It's like 90% ocean and only like 10% land. So what determines the carbon cycle and what ultimately determines climate is the oceans. So here's the short to medium term carbon cycle on the ocean by way of photosynthesis, by green plants on the surface of the ocean, phytoplankton. And here's the familiar one on land, photosynthesis again, the leaves of trees and green plants, and they absorb carbon dioxide, and when they decline, decay, and die and are decomposed by microorganisms, the carbon is released back to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And the same thing is happening here in the case of phytoplankton, while in addition carbon diffuses into and out of the ocean. And in both of these situations, in the pre-industrial state, the carbon was in balance. Because photosynthesis uses and takes in energy from the sun, all of the what we call fossil fuels, the energy in those fossil fuels which we burn, it all originally started off as energy from the sun. So here's the formation of fossil carbon coal, the ultra long-term carbon cycle over millions of years. It's formed by trees and the forests of the ancient swamps. 300 million years ago, we're talking about a very different planet. The planet was all ocean and swamps. So the forests that grew in the swamps, they ended up forming coal over millions of years with heat and pressure. The fossil carbon, oil, and gas was formed by a ocean process, and phytoplankton took in energy from the sun and for their growth, and the phytoplankton were consumed by other plankton, the zooplankton, and that formed a food chain with marine organisms getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And this would decline, decay, die, and decompose, and end up on the bottom of the ocean floor on the sediment. It would be incorporated in the sediment, and over millions of years of heat and pressure, this would form fossil carbon as oil and gas. If the temperature is high enough, it'll form gas. Otherwise, it'll form oil. And these get actually incorporated into the rocks, and what happened over millions of years was that the oil got squeezed out of the rocks and managed to make its way up towards the surface a little bit more. This third one is very interesting and also important because it's a major permanent carbon sink, and that's the formation of limestone, which is calcium carbonate rock. Now, this is formed in the oceans, as again hundreds of millions of years ago, and it was formed by the ability of the special ability of some of the small zooplankton and then the larger marine organisms to make shells. And the shells are what these organisms can do is they can manufacture calcium carbonate. So there's the carbon of the calcium carbonate in shells, and those organisms decline and die and decompose and such, and they fall to the ocean floor. They become incorporated into the ocean sediment, and with heat and pressure and millions of years of time, that gets compressed and converted into limestone rock. The other one is dolomite. So this is my attempt of showing that over hundreds of millions of years, this rock becomes, we're familiar with it on land, as there are hills of whole hills of limestone, and of course there are the famous limestone cliffs. They were all formed like this in the ancient oceans. The first thing to consider then is that ecologically these are not fossil fuels. We just call them fossil fuels over the past couple of hundred years. Ecologically, these are the planet's, the Earth's carbon sinks. And if these carbon sinks hadn't been operating for hundreds of millions of years, we wouldn't be here. It would be a completely different planet. Life forms would be totally different. It wouldn't be a very rich and diverse planet, that's for sure, because it would be a planet with vast amounts of carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere, so it would be completely different. So it's this process over hundreds of millions of years that has allowed all of the mammals to evolve, all other life forms to evolve, and to the state today where there's more diversity of life than at any other time in the Earth's history. However, that's rapidly being wiped out by industrial civilization. This is an illustration from the same page of both carbon cycles, the short to medium and the ultra long. This is the most popular illustration for the scientific organizations. For example, it's in the National Academies of Science on climate change. So there are two pairs of carbon cycles, actually. Of course, there's a land carbon cycle and there's an ocean carbon cycle, but what's most important is that there's a fast to medium carbon cycle up here, and then there's a ultra slow long-term carbon cycle, which is shown down here below the white line. So slightly different approach to the last illustration. This takes millions of years on land from the ancient forests with millions of years of heat and pressure. First of all, we have peat formed, and then as time progresses, we have coal formed. So here's the short to medium term carbon cycle from green plants photosynthesize. They get eaten by animals, and both the plants and the animals die. They decline and decay and decompose, and microbial decomposition on the Earth's surface results in the carbon dioxide going back up into the atmosphere. There are some numbers here that don't matter because the original illustration shows how much carbon is involved in each of these processes. So here's the ocean formation of fossil carbon. It starts with phytoplankton. They photosynthesize, and from the I should say first there's the short-term carbon cycle of the ocean, carbon dioxide diffusing into the surface and out of the surface of the ocean, and some return from the death of the phytoplankton finds its way into the atmosphere. So the long-term marine cycle, which is down here, is that the phytoplankton, by photosynthesis, they start the marine food chain, and this involves zooplankton and also involves shell-making organisms. So all this mass disintegrates and it falls down to the ocean floor. It gets incorporated into the sediments of the ocean. So it's the same thing: plant and animal life, death, decay, and compression and temperature. Forms oil and gas. If the temperature is very high, it can form a gas. If the temperature is not that high, it can form oil. And the other special case is that the shell-making organisms who are part of this food chain, they make up what's called the biological carbon pump, which is a process depending on this food chain and life forms that pumps carbon taken from carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the depths of the sediments, and then over millions of years, heat and pressure, it gets converted into limestone. And we know that as limestone hills and limestone cliffs. And I think most people probably have heard at some time or another that this is all marine life, seashells and so forth. So there's a seashell on the bottom of the sediment illustrating that part of the process. So there's quite a lot of my amateurish attempt at illustrations and modifying illustrations to try and make the points clear that I want to communicate. This one is especially important. This is the ocean biological carbon pump. It's a pump for a food chain, but what's crucial for climate is that it pumps carbon from the atmosphere down deep into the ocean sediment, and that ends up making limestone, because these little zooplankton that can make shells, their shells is calcium carbonate. So the carbon is the carbonate. So CO2, the phytoplankton here, CO2 taken up by phytoplankton to begin with, and then those consumed by zooplankton, the special shell-making zooplankton, and then of course we're familiar with the bigger shell-making marine organisms, crabs and lobsters and such like. So these go through the process of decline and death and decomposition, and they form this aggregate, and it slowly sinks to the bottom of the ocean. There's more food chain exchange going on here, and it gets incorporated into the sediment as we've just seen. So nutrients get exchanged through the biological pump here, and the carbon-containing product, the carbon-containing detritus, works down into the bottom of the floor in the sediment here. So it starts with phytoplankton. They're consumed by zooplankton, and they sink to the bottom, and compression over millions of years of heat and temperature forms oil and gas. And limestone is formed by the zooplankton that can make shells, and shells is calcium carbonate, and that goes to the bottom. There's a current of the ocean which is driven by the different ocean temperatures, and that's essential to ocean health and marine life. And that's a big reason why ocean warming is a very bad thing for the planet, for the biosphere. Now I should show this one, because This is the illustration that's used more than any other for showing the carbon cycle in terms of global climate change, and it was produced by UNEP. I did do some adaptation on it. I was surprised that the slowest carbon cycle that they had was very slow, more than 100 years. But if you look at the gray arrow around here that goes all the way around, well, clearly that's the ultra slow carbon cycle of thousands to millions of years. I also just want to notice you'll come across the term land use changes. That's the climate change name for agriculture and deforestation. Deforestation is a very significant emitter of carbon dioxide, and in actual fact the main contribution from deforestation is not the fact that the trees aren't there anymore to absorb carbon dioxide. The main contribution is that most of the carbon in a forest is actually on the ground. It's in the litter and the duff of the forest floor, and when that's disturbed it releases huge amounts of carbon dioxide.